Japanese companies are accelerating a complete exit from China. High risk, bad attitude, no profit. China's economic downturn, foreign capital outflow, sluggish domestic demand, real estate collapse, and deteriorating investment environment, coupled with the spread of anti-Japanese sentiment, have caused many Japanese companies to accelerate their withdrawal from China. Recently, a Japanese media outlet compiled a list of Japanese companies that have left the Chinese market. In response, veteran Japanese journalist Akio Yaita summarized three main reasons why Japanese companies are distancing themselves from China: high risk, bad attitude, and no profit. Akio Yaita wrote on Facebook, "Recently, the Japanese media compiled a list of well-known Japanese companies that have withdrawn from China. I was deeply moved after reading it. 17 years ago, when I first arrived in Beijing as a special correspondent for the Japanese Sankei Shimbun, I wrote articles almost every month about prominent Japanese companies entering China. I was often approached by small and medium-sized Japanese business owners who flew to Beijing, hoping I could introduce some promising projects as they were eager to invest in China." He recalled, "At that time, I would say, on the surface, China appears to offer many opportunities, but in reality, there are numerous hidden traps. The biggest risk is that China is a society governed by people, not laws. When leadership changes, policies change accordingly. Unfortunately, many people didn't heed my advice and still invested. While some companies made profits in the early years, almost all have since either withdrawn or are considering doing so." The article noted that for foreign companies, the current business environment in China is indeed poor. In June and September this year, 2 Japanese schools in Suzhou and Shenzhen were attacked by anti-Japanese groups. Last year, a Japanese pharmaceutical executive was arrested in Beijing as a spy. But China has yet to disclose details of the case to Japan, deepening concerns about the safety of Japanese nationals in China. Japanese companies are also feeling the impact of today's geopolitical tensions. The United States is pushing a strategy to prevent China from acquiring cutting-edge semiconductor technology, urging allies, including Japan, to act in concert. Meanwhile, China has warned Japan that it will take severe economic retaliatory measures if it restricts the sale of semiconductor manufacturing equipment and related services to Chinese companies. In a survey conducted by the Japan Chamber of Commerce in China, 60% of 1,760 companies reported that the economic situation has worsened compared to last year. Many companies are gradually shifting their focus to Asia and other regions outside of China. Akio Yaita bluntly stated that China is no longer as important to Japanese exporters as it once was. Last year, China accounted for less than 18% of Japan's exports, the lowest level since 2015. High risks, bad attitudes, and no profit. Naturally, Japanese companies have chosen to distance themselves from China. According to a Nikkei report on October 5th, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry analyzed data from a survey of about 5,300 overseas subsidiaries of Japanese companies, manufacturing firms in which Japanese companies hold more than half of the shares, and found that from April to June, Japanese companies' capital investment in mainland China and Hong Kong, in US dollars, decreased by 16% year-on-year. Among Japanese companies' overseas investments, mainland China and Hong Kong accounted for 13.6%, which has been lower than Europe for 2 consecutive quarters. This is the first time since the January-March quarter of 2016 that the share has been lower than Europe's. Previously, from April to June 2019, mainland China and Hong Kong accounted for 18.6% of Japanese companies' overseas investments, meaning it has dropped by nearly 5 percentage points in 5 years. In 2024, Europe's share increased by about 1 percentage point from April to June, reaching 13.8%, while North America's share increased by about 10 percentage points to 36.8%. The report highlighted that while China remains Japan's second-largest export destination and its largest source of imports, investment is declining. The reduction in Japanese investment in China has been influenced by the performance of automobile manufacturers. Sales of Japanese transportation machinery firms in China have continued to decline by over 20% year-on-year since 2024. In June, Nissan closed its Changzhou plant, which had an annual production capacity of 130,000 vehicles, or 10% of its total production in China. Nissan is also considering cutting production at other factories. In July, Honda shut down its plant in Guangdong Province and announced plans to suspend production at its plant in Hubei Province. Even when factoring in the new EV plant, annual production capacity will be reduced by 290,000 vehicles. In another report published the same day, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun stated that the investment brake isn't limited to the automotive industry. Japan's DIC will exit China's liquid crystal materials business by 2024. China's economic slowdown has intensified competition further. Facing increasingly fierce price competition, Ajinomoto plans to consolidate and sell 3 frozen food factories, concentrating operations in one location. In July, Japan's Shiseido halted the sale of its high-end cosmetics brand Baum in China. Shiseido president Kentaro Fujiwara remarked, "Consumers are becoming more price-conscious, and we may continue to withdraw unprofitable brands." China's stock market soars and plummets. Analysis warns of possible collapse. Recently, China's stock market has experienced wild fluctuations, soaring and plummeting. Some institutions have warned that a repeat of the 2015 stock market crash may be on the horizon. Analysts argue that the Chinese government's manipulation of the stock market this time has clearly deviated from the principles of financial markets. If they fail to hit the brakes, the market could eventually slide toward a Minsky moment. The Minsky moment, named after American economist Hyman Minsky, refers to a financial market crisis, particularly in credit markets, triggered by a sudden, systemic collapse in asset prices. This is essentially the bursting of an economic bubble. Since September 24th, the Chinese government has introduced a series of rescue measures, including interest rate cuts, reductions in the reserve requirement ratio, lower down payment ratios for home purchases, and injected around 1 trillion yuan of long-term liquidity into the financial market, spending 800 billion yuan to support the stock market. The Chinese stock market then surged abnormally up until the day before the National Day holiday. Over the past 4 years, the A-share market has seen a continuous 3-year decline. In just 1 week, this round of gains pushed the A-share index from 2,600 points to over 3,600 points. At the same time, Chinese officials strongly promoted the arrival of a bull market. According to mainland media reports, the number of new stock accounts opened during the National Day holiday reached as high as 1 million. Among them, a leading brokerage opened nearly 300,000 new accounts. Some brokerages noted that people born in the 1980s and 1990s are the main force behind these new accounts, with even many born in the 2000s participating. On October 8th, China's National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, held a press conference but did not announce the trillion yuan economic stimulus plan that the market had been expecting, instead reiterating existing policies, which disappointed many. As a result, both the Hong Kong and Chinese stock markets fell, with investors describing the market as a roller coaster. Compared with the U.S. stock market, China's A-shares have inherent flaws, with the most relevant being the difference in investor structure. The U.S. stock market is largely institutional, with a high proportion of institutional investors, providing a solid foundation for the market. China's A-shares, by contrast, are primarily retail-driven, with a low proportion of institutional investors. Retail investors tend to favor short-term speculation, which exacerbates market volatility, although institutional investors are not immune to similar short-term thinking. The Chinese government's efforts to stimulate the stock and real estate markets have deviated from the principles of financial markets, accelerating leverage and risk. If they don't apply the brakes, the market may continue sliding toward a Minsky moment. Nomura Securities' latest report suggests that after the current frenzy, China's stock market could collapse. Repeating the tragedy of 2015, Li Xin believes that China's economy is already in a terminal state. Apart from massive money printing by the central bank, which dilutes the value of the people's savings, the Chinese government has no real solutions for the country's economic problems. Fundamentally, the authorities lack both the will and determination to address these issues at their core.
How bad is China's economy? Every sector is declining. How bad is China's economy, given weak consumer spending, global resistance to Chinese dumped goods, and the fact that the real estate market has not yet stopped falling and stabilized? Beijing launched a package of stimulus measures in September, including interest rate cuts and reserve requirement ratio cuts, but the outside world doubts that these measures are enough to solve economic problems. This fall, the vast majority of global banks expect that China's economy will not achieve the 5% growth target set by the Communist Party of China. More than 4/5 of economists surveyed by Bloomberg predict that China's GDP growth will not reach 5% in 2024, and analysts, including Bank of America, question the fiscal and monetary policies of the Communist Party of China. At present, domestic deflationary pressures in China are rising, with new home prices falling the most since 2014 and consumer confidence falling to the lowest point in a year and a half. Beijing is still determined to implement the policy of high-end manufacturing and exports to promote economic recovery, but trade itself faces risks. Although exports have reached the highest level in nearly 2 years, the unit price of goods is falling, and foreign countries are increasingly wary of Beijing's new round of cheap goods shockwaves. There is a lot of debate about whether China's economy will fall into a decade of stagnation similar to Japan's. Every sector of China's economy is declining. Simply put, every sector of China's economy is in trouble. When the CCP lifted COVID restrictions and reopened the border at the end of 2022, people had optimistically predicted that Chinese people would engage in revenge shopping, dining out, and traveling, boosting consumption and the economy. But the boost was short-lived and soon disappeared against the backdrop of people's concerns about economic growth, falling house prices, unemployment, and income. As of September, manufacturing activity has been in contraction since April 2023, with only 3 months as an exception. China's share of global manufacturing is as high as 30%. Its manufacturing trade surplus accounts for a large share of world GDP and has grown at an average rate of 2% in the past. China's manufacturing scale is larger than the combined manufacturing surpluses of Japan and Germany at their peak. Foreign governments worry that they can't resist the production growth rate of China's manufacturing industry. When China's production growth rate exceeds its own demand, or the global economic growth rate, the rest of the world can only be forced to scale down or even close industries. In addition, the scale of the CCP's industrial subsidy support is shocking, far exceeding that of other countries. Research by the think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, found that China spends about 5% of its GDP on industrial subsidies, which is 10 times that of the United States, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. In industries such as semiconductors, steel, and aluminum, China's subsidies account for 80% to 90% of global subsidies. On the other hand, weak Chinese demand has also hurt the profits of foreign automakers from Stellantis NV to Aston Martin. At the same time, global consumer brands from Starbucks to Estée Lauder have also found that sales in the Chinese market have plummeted, and Chinese consumers are increasingly looking to save money. The most telling indicator of fragile domestic confidence is that Chinese bank loans to the real economy shrank for the first time in 19 years this summer. Local governments, which are already cash-strapped and burdened with hidden debts, have also been dragged down by the housing market crash. Local land sales revenues have been falling at a record pace, making it more difficult to reverse the decline in budget spending when the economy is in desperate need of fiscal support. The youth unemployment rate rose for the second consecutive month in August, reaching the highest level this year. This unemployment rate indicator is a figurative indicator that was just put into use after the Chinese Communist Party changed its statistical caliber. International urban explorer Darman Richter told the British newspaper Express that the city has a post-apocalyptic feel that doesn't compare to anywhere else he's been. Even in Chernobyl, you tend to run into other tour groups or see the furniture rearranged by the countless photographers who visited before you, Mr. Richter said. Kangbashi district was utterly untouched, though, and walking through the silent streets was an unnerving experience.
They all lost their jobs overnight. The sudden breakup impacted Beijing, Shanghai, and Dalian. Programmer Zhang Heng arrived at the Huanyu building in Phase 1 of Zhongguancun Software Park as usual. This is the location of IBM's Software R&D Center. Early Saturday morning, Zhang Heng received an email from IBM headquarters addressed to all employees. The day before, his and his colleagues' intranet access had been revoked. The email notified them of an online meeting scheduled for Monday. It was the longest weekend Zhang Heng had ever experienced. The meeting started on time that morning. IBM's Vice President of Global Enterprise System Development spoke first, saying it had been a very difficult decision, but the development tasks in China would be transferred to other overseas bases. Immediately afterward, the general manager in charge of IBM ZeeD and Linux One and the vice president of storage engineering also spoke. The three executives concluded the meeting in less than 3 minutes. In a few short sentences, the fate of IBM's China R&D Center was sealed. Thousands of employees across Beijing, Shanghai, and Dalian, including those from the China Development Laboratory, CDL, and the China Systems Laboratory, CLS, lost their jobs overnight. From that point on, IBM only maintained consulting, sales, and technical support operations in China. Within the next 2 days, Zhang Heng received his severance package. There was a 2-month buffer period, compensation of N+3, and the year-end bonus to be paid out the following year. The process moved so quickly that Zhang Heng barely had time to react. It felt like being dumped by a heartless partner. Gradually disintegrating, collapsing in an instant. Hemingway's novel The Sun Also Rises describes a businessman in a desperate situation. Zhang Heng also felt his company disintegrating and crumbling in the same way. It turns out that real departures always happen quietly. IBM's research center in Beijing was established in September 1995. At that time, IBM was the first multinational IT company to set up a research and development institution in China. Soon after, other companies like Intel followed suit. That same year, Huawei established a research institute in Beijing, focusing on the newly emerging field of data communication. When IBM entered China, it was actually going through a financial crisis. Years of losses had piled up, totaling more than $16 billion. Lou Gerstner, the CEO at the time, tried various approaches and began implementing a series of reform strategies. By 1997, IBM had returned to profitability. On Christmas Eve that year, Ren Zhengfei visited many IT giants, including IBM. Unlike other companies, IBM did not treat Ren with suspicion. Instead, they spent a whole day explaining project management to him. It was this open attitude that won IBM its first management consulting business in China. They quickly put together a plan and sent 70 consultants to Huawei. Depending on their level, the consultants earned $300, $500, or $680 per hour. In 1998, Huawei's total sales were only 8.9 billion yuan. Nevertheless, Huawei agreed without hesitation. Ren Zhengfei said that the reform assistance IBM provided was like a pair of American shoes. Even if the heels were cut off, they still had to be worn. The prescription IBM gave to Huawei was called Integrated Product Development, IPD. Before the reform, Huawei's R&D departments were independent and fragmented. Afterward, R&D became a market-driven process. At the time, Huawei already had 20,000 employees, but due to the tough reforms, 30% of the staff in the chip R&D department alone left. When IPD was introduced, Huawei had already invested 2 years in 3G R&D. Back then, 2G was still the mainstream, and developing 3G was an uncertain venture. But IPD turned that venture into a clearly structured process. We all know what happened next. It was 3G that pushed Huawei to new heights. By June 2003, IBM consultants had left Huawei's R&D building in Bantian, Shenzhen. By then, IPD thinking had become deeply ingrained in Huawei's operations. A team of internal process experts trained by Huawei was ready to take over from the IBM consultants. When people looked at IPD again, it was 2021. In the wave of new car manufacturing, Li Auto was the first car company to announce it would fully adopt Huawei's IPD approach. More than 20 years ago, Huawei required its executives to read The Power of Pace. This was the exact book that IBM executives had given to Ren Zhengfei. More than 20 years later, many of the books on Li Xiang's reading list for executives are related to Huawei's IPD. One of the important research products of IBM's China Research Institute was Watson. Watson is the precursor to large language models. It was developed 5 years before AlphaGo defeated Go champion Lee Sedol and 11 years before ChatGPT. IBM actually took only 4 years to develop Watson. At that time, there were a total of 30 researchers worldwide participating in the project. In addition to the United States, Japan, and Israel, China was also involved. Until it was shut down in 2021, Watson remained the flagship product of the China Research Institute, and it did experience a period of commercial success in China. IBM first ventured into the field of clinical applications for cancer treatment. IBM commissioned a consulting company to conduct a survey at the time, and they found that in some areas of Northeast China, doctors' treatment plans for cancer patients aligned with standard guidelines. However, building a hospital information system is extremely expensive. For high-end private hospitals, the cost may reach hundreds of millions of dollars. Additionally, doctors' interests were deeply tied to pharmaceutical companies, and the introduction of Watson would undoubtedly disrupt these relationships. Even in the face of these challenges, Watson entered the market in 2016. By analyzing 300 medical journals, over 200 textbooks, and nearly 15 million pages of text, Watson was able to assist oncologists in formulating treatment plans. By 2018, Watson's medical system had spread to nearly 80 hospitals in 22 provinces and 43 cities in China. Sales revenue from the Greater China region accounted for half of Watson Medical's global quarterly revenue. The digitalization of China's banking industry started with IBM. In the 1980s, the People's Bank of China launched the YBS Bank Insurance System project, and a key part of this was the introduction of the IBM 360 system. The digitalization of 13 Chinese banks in Hong Kong was also facilitated by IBM. In 1987, IBM's customized SAFE2 system for ICBC was rolled out on a large scale. Soon, the Bank of China and China Construction Bank followed suit. At that time, most banks still operated manually, keeping accounts by hand. IBM began with banks, and as its business expanded, it leveraged its customer base and servers to sell software and services, becoming a dominant force. However, this honeymoon period didn't last long. For well-known reasons, the banking industry began phasing out the IOE system starting in 2013. Zhong Nanhai is in crisis. Analysis: Xi compromises with political elders. China is in a political and economic crisis, and the authorities appear helpless. At the October 1st reception marking the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China this year, retired Communist Party elders such as Li Ruihuan and Wen Jiabao made a high-profile appearance, sparking widespread interpretations. Some analysts believe that, under mounting pressure, Xi Jinping, the leader of the Communist Party of China, has compromised with party elders due to the ongoing economic crisis. On September 26th, the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China held an economic meeting, during which Xi Jinping unusually admitted that new situations and problems had emerged in the Chinese economy. Subsequently, the Communist Party of China announced a series of rescue measures, including interest rate cuts, reserve requirement ratio reductions, and lower down payment ratios for home purchases. These actions provided the financial market with approximately 1 trillion yuan in long-term liquidity and injected 800 billion yuan to support the stock market. On October 8th, the Chinese authorities stated that most of China's nearly 6 trillion yuan in government investment this year has been allocated to specific projects. On the evening of September 30th, the October 1st reception was held in Beijing. Footage broadcast by the CCP's official media showed that both former and current members of the Standing Committee sat together at a large table that night, with former Premier Wen Jiabao and former CPPCC Chairman Li Ruihuan seated next to Xi Jinping. This triggered various speculations from observers. This arrangement reportedly confirmed that during the recent Beidaihe meeting, many party elders sent representatives to pressure Xi. Now, these elders are being brought out to create a harmonious atmosphere. It seems clear that Xi Jinping's previously consolidated power has suffered a setback, and the struggling domestic economy is forcing him to adopt rescue policies reminiscent of Wen Jiabao's approach. Wen Jiao, a Chinese political commentator, said on his show, "Wen Jiao talks about the past and present, on October 3rd that Wen Jiabao was once a representative of the liberal faction within the Communist Party, while Xi has taken a different, more conservative direction. The fact that Wen Jiabao is sitting next to Xi this time suggests that Xi and the former senior leaders are coexisting harmoniously and have reached some form of reconciliation within the party. However, beneath this surface-level harmony, deeper tensions may still exist.
In the past few years, the last link that has maintained the U.S.-China relationship has been the U.S.'s financial investment in China. The U.S. has sent $2 trillion in financial investment to China during this period. This money has only delayed the collapse of the Chinese economy, but it has caused U.S. investments to bleed. Now, Wall Street's wishful thinking has essentially cut off the supply of financial flows to China. Cheng Xiaoneng, a special commentator for Radio Free Asia, recently wrote that when it comes to foreign investment, most people only pay attention to direct investment in China, which is the so-called greenfield investment for building factories and opening stores. In fact, the larger part is not greenfield investment, but financial investment. From the latest annual report of the State Administration of Foreign Exchange of China, it can be seen that by the end of 2022, the total foreign financial investment received by the CCP was $2 trillion, of which about $80 billion was before 2017, and 60% of the $2 trillion was invested in China in 2019 and 2020. At that time, the CCP was just about to ignite the Sino-US Cold War, but Wall Street was not aware of it. According to official data released by the CCP, 40% of the $2 trillion in financial investment bought bonds of Chinese companies, and the other 60% was invested in private equity funds in China. The so-called private equity fund is a joint venture agreement signed between foreign investors and Chinese startups. As partners, Western investors cannot withdraw their shares within 10 years, regardless of the prospects of the startup. Only after the startup is successfully listed can Western investors sell their equity and recover their investment and profits. A large number of startups have emerged in China in the past few years, largely because of this money. After the deterioration of Sino-US relations, the path for these Chinese startups to go public in the United States was blocked, and China's stock market has been hovering around 3,000 points, once falling to 2,700 points this year. So it is difficult for Chinese startups to go public in China or Hong Kong. As a result, the bubble of Chinese startups generated by U.S. financial investment also burst. At the peak of foreign venture capital, 51,302 startups were established in China in 2018. By the end of last year, only 1,000 were left, only a fraction of that. Of course, these financial investments by Wall Street were basically swallowed up. Recently, the Financial Times of the United Kingdom reported that foreign investors now say that China's startups are an entire industry dying before our eyes, and Wall Street has almost no hope left. Western investors now believe that the risks of engaging with China are too great, so they have begun to stay away from any investment in China. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, a well-known American investment management company keen on making venture capital in China, said in an interview with Bloomberg TV on September 18th that there are real problems in China, and that the environment in China is changing and becoming increasingly difficult. Only a small part of the company's investment portfolio is now in China. If things continue like this, the collapse of China's middle class will come very quickly. Yesterday, September 30th, I had a one-on-one consultation with a young man under 30. He said his student days went very smoothly. He was admitted to Fudan High School and later to Fudan University. However, a few years after graduation, he encountered an economic downturn and deflation. Not only did he have to work 996 hours per week, but he also had no hope of advancing. Although housing prices have fallen, they are still far from affordable. This is a huge contrast to his success as a student. He feels like a workhorse, constantly working without seeing any hope. During the consultation, I felt he was very depressed. He complained that being stuck in this deflationary era prevented him from accumulating wealth and escaping the fate of a workhorse. However, the real root of the problem is not the era itself, but the false narratives pushed by mainstream public opinion. The harvester secretly took your money and fooled you into blaming it on the deflationary era. If you don't understand this, you are likely to follow the same path as many older generations of students from prestigious schools. Deflation is not the fault of the workhorses, because neither inflation nor deflation directly affects their productivity. What is deflation? Deflation is a drop in prices, such as a bun's price falling from 3 yuan to 2 yuan. For the producer of the bun, the income from selling it also drops from 3 yuan to 2 yuan. In other words, deflation means a drop in prices for consumers and a corresponding drop in income for producers. So if prices in society fall by 10%, it can be concluded that all producers' incomes will also fall by 10%. However, as my income falls by 10%, the purchasing power of the money corresponding to my income increases by 10% because prices have fallen. Thus, the decline in income and the increase in the purchasing power of money cancel each other out, and my actual income remains unchanged. The same principle applies to inflation. My income increases by 10%, and the purchasing power of money falls by 10%, leaving my actual income unchanged. The reason behind this is that money itself is merely a medium of exchange. The key to a person's perception of wealth and poverty lies in the ratio of their labor exchange with others. For example, if I earn 3 times as much as a courier, the labor ratio between us is 1 to 3. I can work for 1 hour and exchange it for 3 hours of the courier's labor, making me feel rich while the courier feels poor. Wealth and poverty are not about the absolute amount of money earned, nor are they influenced by deflation or inflation. In summary, the economy is a zero-sum game once you remove the influence of money, and the essence of it lies in labor exchange. What is currency hunger, and how can we understand it? Let me explain through a real experience from my past. After graduating from college, I worked in Japan for a while. The first thing I did upon arriving was to open a bank account. I was surprised to find that Japanese banks are closed on weekends. I asked my Japanese colleagues about this, and they explained that since everyone takes the weekend off, bank employees must do the same. I asked why banks don't encourage employees to work overtime on weekends to serve those who can't visit during the week and gain a competitive advantage. The answer was simple. No one would give up their vacation for a little overtime pay, and it would also generate negative public opinion. I noticed other similar phenomena, like the fact that there are very few breakfast stalls in Japan because no one is willing to wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning to prepare and sell food. At night, shuttle buses and snack stalls at tourist spots also don't stay open very late. In other words, even if you have money in Japan, the services you can buy are limited. I think this is likely the case in some wealthy European countries as well. When I returned to China, I discussed this with friends who had lived in various countries, and we all agreed that Shanghai has the best service in the world. For instance, in Shanghai, you can order barbecue takeout at 1 a.m., and the delivery person will bring it to your home. But in Europe and Japan, very few people are willing to work at that hour. In other words, the reason you can buy the best service in Shanghai is that the service providers are poor and need the money. The harsh truth here is that the biggest asset of the rich isn't money, it's the poor. Expectations were dashed, and Chinese stocks fell across the board. Financial experts criticized Beijing for sawing off arrows to heal wounds. On the first trading day after the National Day holiday, China's National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, failed to release major initiatives as anticipated by the market. The 12 trillion ammunition promoted by the media fell flat. A shares pulled back after an initial surge, and Chinese stocks in the U.S. markets dropped sharply. Bilibili plunged more than 15%, while Alibaba fell over 7%. Experts criticized the Chinese Communist Party's CCP approach as sawing off arrows to heal wounds, deceiving the public into the market, which they viewed as essentially a sham. On Tuesday, October 8th, the Shanghai Composite Index and CSI 300 Index both opened high. Many Chinese investors rushed to buy stocks, hoping for major moves from the National Development and Reform Commission as hinted by state media. However, the NDRC merely declared at the press conference that it would launch a package of incremental policies with no specific supportive measures. The 12 trillion in post-holiday ammunition promoted by Chinese media failed to materialize. As a result, the stock market quickly shifted from gains to losses. Some investors lamented online, "I just bought today and I'm already losing money." While A-shares closed in positive territory, Chinese stocks in the U.S. markets experienced broad declines that same day. According to public data, on October 8th, the Nasdaq Golden Dragon China Index fell over 8% at one point and closed down nearly 5%. Tiger Securities plunged over 23%, closing down nearly 20%. Among popular Chinese stocks, Mengniu Dairy ADR dropped 22.8%. Meituan ADR fell 16.5%, while Alibaba fell more than 6%, and Pinduoduo nearly 6%. Prior to this, Chinese media had hyped the 12 trillion post-holiday ammunition, and some economists had called for a 10 trillion investment plan, raising market expectations for Tuesday's NDRC press conference. According to Kailian Shi, within just 20 minutes of market opening, the Shanghai and Shenzhen stock markets saw turnover exceeding 1 trillion yuan. In the morning, the Shanghai Composite Index surged 10.13% to a high of 3,674 points. The Shenzhen Component Index rose 12.67%, and the Chinext Index soared 18.44%. However, following the NDRC press conference, disappointment spread, and by 10:40 a.m., Shanghai A-shares had dropped to a low of 3,372 points. Reuters reported that during the high-profile press conference, Beijing policymakers outlined only a general plan and provided no details on the radical stimulus measures investors had hoped for, greatly disappointing the market. Previously, Song Xiangqian, founding partner and chairman of China Capital, had posted on WeChat on October 4th, discussing the irrational exuberance in China's stock market. He pointed out that there is no economic theory proving that the wealth effect from a stock market boost can solve issues like deflation and insufficient demand. Veteran financial journalist Wang Jian echoed Song's sentiment. In an interview with Radio Free Asia, he compared Beijing's stock market strategy to sawing off arrows to heal wounds. He explained that although the rapier may be cut off, the arrowhead remains lodged in the body, eventually leading to fatal infection. Stock prices may rise, but without economic improvement or corporate profit growth, they will inevitably fall.